A few bikers messed with the wrong female Navy SEAL. They thought they were just looking for a score, another covert mission and a string of them, part of their larger plan to dominate global weapons markets. Inside a hidden research facility, a few unsuspecting scientists, a couple of overconfident guards. What they didn't count on was Rachel Hawk, a Navy SEAL, sharp, stealthy, and calculating, with a fierce determination to stop them. The facility's heavily guarded perimeter wasn't a challenge for Rachel. She'd breached harder places before. But what they didn't expect was that Rachel wasn't just any SEAL. She was on a mission to uncover and destroy the world's most dangerous piece of research. A weapon capable of toppling governments and rewriting the balance of global power. She was prepared for the worst. She had to be. But what she didn't anticipate was how deep the corruption ran, or how far the people behind it would go to ensure their secrets stayed hidden. As Rachel fought her way through the facility, the lines between enemies blurred. An escape seemed impossible, but failure wasn't an option. With every turn she was closing in on the truth, but the closer she got, the more deadly the game became. The facility wasn't just a lab, it was a ticking time bomb. In the final moments of her escape, with danger closing in from all sides, Rachel made a choice, one last stand. But the question remained, would the truth be enough to stop them, or would the mission cost her everything? This is the story of how a few bikers picked the wrong female Navy SEAL to mess with, and how one woman's courage and resolve turned a covert mission into a fight for survival, and for the fate of the world. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The roar of the motorcycle engines echoed through the night air as the group of bikers surrounded her. The night was cold, and the only light came from the distant glow of street lamps. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying for it. "You're making a big mistake, lady," one of the bikers growled, his leather jacket creaking as he pulled out a knife. The others, half-drunk and laughing, circled closer, thinking they had the upper hand. But they didn't know who they were messing with. Sergeant Rachel Davis, Navy SEAL, stood still, her eyes locked on the men, every muscle in her body poised like a coiled spring. Her body was trained to withstand the worst, her mind sharper than any blade. The bikers thought she was just another woman, another target. They were wrong. With lightning speed, Rachel grabbed the biker who had lunged at her with the knife, spinning him around and slamming him into the concrete with one arm. His knife skittered across the pavement, useless now. Another biker rushed forward, but Rachel was already moving, her legs sweeping him off his feet and sending him crashing into the side of a parked car. His body crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit it. The remaining bikers froze, eyes wide, realizing their mistake. But it was too late. Rachel was already on the next one, delivering a crushing blow to his ribs that sent him gasping for air. The fourth biker hesitated, his eyes darting around, looking for a way out. "Not so tough now, are we?" Rachel's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel in her tone. But just as she took a step toward him, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the sharp bark of a gunshot. Rachel instinctively dropped to the ground, her heart racing. She heard a second shot, this one closer. They had guns now. The question wasn't whether she could handle a few more bikers. It was whether she could survive what was about to happen next. Rachel had been on the road for hours, her mission taking her across state lines. She hadn't expected trouble. But when she'd stopped to grab a quick bite at a roadside diner, she had felt the eyes on her. The bikers had been there, loud and rowdy, clearly looking for trouble. They'd sized her up the moment she walked in. At first, it had been nothing, just some bad looks and whispers behind their hands. But as soon as she left the diner, they'd followed. Her hand instinctively moved to the pistol at her side, but she knew better than to draw it just yet. She didn't want to escalate things, but she wouldn't back down either. The storm raged outside, and with it, the countdown to their next escape began. She had been trained for situations like this, prepared for any kind of confrontation. But these guys weren't just your typical troublemakers. No, they were more dangerous than that. This wasn't just about her taking them down. This was a test. As she made her way down the street, she could hear the low rumble of motorcycles getting closer. They were following her. That's when she decided to make her move. She turned into an alleyway, hoping to get a jump on them. Her back against the cold brick wall, she waited. She knew the streets, and she knew how to use her surroundings to her advantage. The first biker turned the corner, and Rachel didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she grabbed him by the throat, slamming him against the wall. He struggled, but she was already on him, her knees pushing into his chest as she twisted his arm behind his back. The sound of his bone cracking under her grip echoed in the narrow alley. The second biker came charging at her, thinking he had the element of surprise. But Rachel was faster. She dodged, grabbing him by the collar and using his own momentum to send him flying into a stack of crates. He groaned, unable to get up. Rachel didn't slow down. She was in full combat mode now, moving with deadly precision. She could hear the others closing in, but she didn't flinch. She was too focused. The next biker came at her from behind, swinging a pipe. She sidestepped, grabbing at mid-swing and pulling him forward into a brutal headbutt. He fell to the ground, dazed and bleeding. It had been easy, too easy. They weren't used to dealing with someone like her, someone who had been trained to fight and survive in the harshest conditions. But as the last of the bikers took a step back, pulling out his knife, Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right. She had won every fight so far, but these men weren't ordinary thugs. They had a viciousness about them, an edge that made Rachel wary. And then the gunshots rang out. The sound was deafening. She hit the ground instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. The first bullet barely missed her, whizzing past her ear, the second shot lodging into the concrete wall just inches from her head. Rachel's mind raced, calculating her next move. Who else wants a taste? She heard one of the bikers shout, a mocking laugh following his words. Rachel didn't answer. She was already moving, sliding into the shadows of the alley, using the darkness as cover. But she could feel them closing in, hear the heavy boots of the remaining bikers following her. The gun was a game changer. It wasn't just about fists anymore. She had to think fast. But just as she turned the corner, ready to face whatever was waiting for her, she heard a voice, a new voice, a voice that sent a jolt of fear through her chest. "Take her alive," the man said, his tone cold and commanding. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the bikers she had to worry about anymore. It was the man behind them. And something told her that if she didn't act fast, she might never leave this alley alive. What happens next? How will Rachel escape the grip of the bikers and the mysterious man who has appeared out of nowhere? Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she took in the situation. The bikers were dangerous, yes, but the voice that had just spoken, cold, controlled, and demanding, had shifted the odds completely. This wasn't just a random encounter anymore. There was something far bigger at play. She backed further into the shadows, her mind racing. She needed to think. The bikers were still a threat, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The voice, however, belonged to someone who did. Someone who knew exactly what she was capable of and had plans for her. Rachel's instincts kicked in. She couldn't take them all on with a gun at her back. She needed to escape. But where? The alley she was in had only one way out, and that was straight into the group of bikers. They'd have her cornered in seconds if she made a run for it. Her eyes darted to the fire escape above her, barely visible in the darkness. It was her only chance. If she could get up there, maybe she could get the upper hand. She silently reached for the metal ladder and, with the grace of a cat, began to climb. The sound of boots scraping against the concrete followed her at every move. She could feel their eyes on her. But she wasn't fast enough. A hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing her ankle. Rachel's stomach lurched. She twisted, kicking her attacker in the face with her boot, but another biker rushed forward, grabbing her by the wrist. She yanked her arm free, using her momentum to flip over him and slam his head into the ground. But just as she started to climb again, the sound of more footsteps made her freeze. They were surrounding her. More bikers had joined in from the street, cutting off her escape route. Rachel's mind raced. She could take on 2 or 3 at a time. No problem. But against this many, she was risking everything. Then she heard it again. Take her alive. The command was repeated, this time sharper, more urgent. It sent a cold chill through Rachel's veins. Whoever this person was, they weren't just an observer. They were in charge, and they weren't going to let Rachel walk away from this. With a grim expression, Rachel made a decision. She wasn't going to let herself be taken alive. The nearest biker lunged at her, his large frame crashing into her chest, but Rachel was already moving. She slid out from beneath him, grabbing his legs and flipping him onto his back. Before he could react, she kicked his gun out of his hand and used it to knock him unconscious. She grabbed his jacket, spinning around to use him as a shield just as another biker took a shot at her. The bullet grazed her shoulder, but she didn't have time to feel the pain. She ducked, using the biker as a human shield and firing 2 quick shots in return. One of the bikers went down. "Is that all you've got?" Rachel shouted, trying to goad them into making the mistake. But she didn't have long. The fire escape was still just within reach, and Rachel needed to get there before it was too late. She had only a moment. The leader, whoever he was, had made it clear that he didn't want her dead. But she wasn't going to stick around to find out why. Rachel twisted, dodging another shot, and finally made it to the bottom rung of the fire escape ladder. She pulled herself up, the pain in her shoulder igniting with every movement, but she ignored it. The sound of the bikers' angry shouts filled the alley, and their footsteps echoed behind her. Come on," she muttered, pushing herself harder. She could already hear the creak of the metal ladder as the bikers began their climb. Just as she reached the top, the rooftop loomed ahead of her like a dark sanctuary. The pain in her arm flared again as she vaulted herself over the edge and onto the roof. But she wasn't safe yet. The bikers weren't far behind. The leader, whoever he was, wasn't going to let her get away so easily. Rachel didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the roof, her feet pounding the hard surface. She could hear the shouts growing louder behind her, but she kept moving, dodging rooftop vents and air conditioning units. She had no plan, no escape route, only one goal: keep running until she found an opening. But then, just as she was about to leap to the next rooftop, something struck her from behind. The force of the blow sent her sprawling forward, her fingers just missing the ledge she had aimed for. She twisted in midair, landing on her back with a hard thud. She gasped for breath, the world spinning as her back slammed into the cold rooftop. She tried to push herself up, but the pain in her shoulder was overwhelming. The last thing she saw before her vision blurred was a pair of black boots stepping into her view. "Did you really think you could escape?" the voice asked, low and menacing. It wasn't the leader's voice, but it was just as cold. Before she could respond, a pair of hands grabbed her roughly, lifting her to her feet. The rest of the bikers had reached the roof now, and they were closing in around her. Rachel could feel her heartbeat racing, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She knew she couldn't take them all down, not like this. And then she saw it. The dark figure who had been giving the orders stepped forward. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself with an air of authority that made the bikers defer to him. He was dressed in a suit, the dark fabric almost blending into the shadows of the night. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto hers. "I told you," he said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "You should have stayed out of this." Rachel tried to focus, but the world was spinning, her vision clouded by the pain and the chaos. She was outnumbered, and now, it seemed, she was outmatched. The gunshots had been a warning, but the real trap was just beginning to close in around her. She had to fight. She couldn't let them take her. But with the leader in front of her, and the bikers closing in from all sides, was there even a way out? What happened next? What is this mysterious group, and why are they after Rachel? The pressure was building. Rachel's mind raced, but her body felt like it was moving in slow motion. The menacing figure in the suit was closing in, his presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. The bikers were all around her now, their eyes hungry with anticipation, waiting for their leader's command. Rachel's pulse hammered in her ears. Her vision was starting to blur from the pain in her shoulder, but she couldn't afford to let up. Her training kicked in. She was a Navy SEAL, not some street fighter. She'd been through worse than this. But this felt different. It was like they were trying to wear her down, push her to a point where she couldn't fight back. And they were getting close. "Where's your courage now?" the man in the suit said, stepping closer. His voice was smooth, almost condescending, but there was something cold underneath. He wasn't just a leader, he was calculating, strategic. Every word he spoke, every movement he made, felt like a piece of a puzzle she wasn't seeing yet. Rachel's fingers twitched toward the knife at her side, but she knew it wouldn't do much against this many. She needed an opening, a chance to turn the tables, but she wasn't getting one. Not like this. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked. His voice was barely a whisper now, like he was speaking only for her to hear. Rachel didn't answer. She knew better than to waste time on words in a situation like this, but she couldn't help herself. "No," she said, her voice cold, "but I'm about to find out." The man's lips twisted into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small device. Rachel's instincts flared immediately, her mind connecting the dots. It was a tracker, something used to locate and track people. She had seen enough of them during her time with the SEALs. He pressed a button, and Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just a tracker, it was a signal. Her heart sank. "Now," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "Now you'll understand." Before she could react, she heard the sound of more motorcycles revving in the distance, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. It was too late to run. She had been marked. Rachel's mind raced, but her body felt numb. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, but she pushed it aside. This was far from over. She was trained for situations like this. The enemy thought they had the upper hand, but they were wrong. The bikers, sensing the moment had come, began to close in, ready to pounce. But as the first one lunged forward, Rachel acted. In one fluid motion, she dropped to the ground, using her legs to sweep the nearest biker off his feet. He went down hard, his body crashing against the rooftop. Rachel didn't pause. As she rose, she grabbed a loose pipe lying nearby and swung it with all her might, knocking another biker off his feet. She was back in control. But the moment she took her eyes off the man in the suit, he lunged forward, grabbing her by the wrist and twisting it behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she gritted her teeth, forcing herself not to cry out. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold, almost disappointed. Rachel struggled, but his grip was firm, and his hold was getting tighter. She could feel the pressure on her wrist, her body being forced into submission. For a moment, she thought she might lose this fight. But then, just as she was about to make her move, she heard a distant roar, a sound that made her heart skip a beat. The sound of more motorcycles, louder now, closer. She wasn't the only one in this fight anymore. Out of the corner of her eye, Rachel spotted a figure descending from the building across the street, moving swiftly. The person was dressed in black, a shadow against the dark sky. The figure dropped to the rooftop with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. And as they hit the ground, a loud crack echoed through the air, the sound of a silenced gunshot. Rachel didn't know who the person was, but the man in the suit did. His eyes flicked to the figure, his face momentarily betraying a hint of panic. It was just enough of a distraction. With a forceful twist, Rachel broke free from the man's grip, her elbow slamming into his side. She didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, she spun around and delivered a punch that sent him stumbling back, his face contorting in surprise. But he recovered quickly, reaching for the gun holstered at his waist. The biker closest to Rachel lunged at her again, but she was ready. She ducked under his swing, sweeping his legs out from beneath him. The guy hit the ground hard, and Rachel didn't waste a second. She grabbed his gun, turned, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the night, and in that moment everything seemed to freeze. The bikers hesitated. The man in the suit paused, his hand still hovering near his weapon. Rachel had the upper hand, for a moment. But then, just as quickly as it had all started, something shifted. The sound of more motorcycles grew even louder. It wasn't just a few stragglers. They were part of a larger group, and they were coming fast. Rachel's mind screamed for her to move, but she wasn't sure if she could. The mysterious figure in black had disappeared into the shadows, and she was alone again. There was no time to figure out what had just happened. The fight was far from over. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You're not as tough as you think," he said, his voice low but venomous. "But we're not here to kill you, Rachel. We need you for something far more important. You're going to wish you hadn't crossed us." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. They weren't after her just because she was a SEAL. They had bigger plans, and she was a part of them now. Before she could react, the sound of the motorcycles reached a deafening roar. More men appeared, all wearing the same dark clothing and helmets, and they were closing in on her faster than she could move. The man in the suit stepped back, as if giving the signal for something. Suddenly, a thick cable shot out from above, wrapping around Rachel's waist before she even had a chance to dodge. Before she could do anything, the cable jerked hard, pulling her into the air. Rachel barely had time to react before she was lifted off her feet, dangling helplessly in midair. The group of bikers closed in around her, blocking her view of everything but the blackness of the sky. And then she saw it. A helicopter, its blades whipping the air, descending rapidly from above. The man in the suit was already smiling, his eyes glinting with something dark and triumphant. Rachel's chest tightened. The night had just turned from a fight for survival into something much, much worse. And she was still dangling from the cable. But where were they taking her? The helicopter's massive blades sliced through the air, creating a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. Rachel swung helplessly, her body jerking violently with each movement as the cable dragged her upward. The shock of the lift hit her like a hammer, disorienting her for a moment. She tried to focus, pushing the dizziness aside, but the rush of air and the disorienting motion made it almost impossible to think straight. The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the belly of the chopper was the faces of the bikers, their expressions filled with a mix of triumph and anticipation. The man in the suit, the one who had been calling the shots, was already climbing aboard the helicopter, his eyes locked onto Rachel with a strange kind of satisfaction. He barely glanced back at the rooftop where the fight had erupted, as though it no longer mattered. For a split second, Rachel allowed herself to hope. Maybe the mysterious figure in black had come to help. But as the helicopter climbed higher, her hope dissolved. She couldn't see anyone else, and the distance between her and the ground only grew. The helicopter door slid shut with a heavy metallic sound, and Rachel was unceremoniously dragged into the cargo hold. Her head hit the metal floor, the impact rattling her teeth. She groaned, shaking off the disorientation, but her hands were still bound tightly by the cable around her waist. The man in the suit, now seated across from her, leaned back in his chair. He stared at her, his eyes cold, calculating, almost amused. His earlier arrogance had returned, but now it was mixed with something else, something Rachel couldn't quite place. "Get up," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "We're not finished yet." Rachel's chest tightened as she slowly pushed herself to her knees. Her shoulder was still throbbing from the earlier gunshot wound, but she ignored the pain. She had to keep her head in the game. She couldn't let them see weakness. Not now. The man leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You're tougher than I thought. You're exactly the kind of person we need." Rachel remained silent, her mind racing. What was this all about? They hadn't killed her, and they didn't seem like typical criminals. This wasn't just about kidnapping her for ransom or revenge. The man had spoken with a purpose. He wasn't here just to harm her. There was something bigger going on, something she wasn't seeing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice strained but firm. "What do you want with me?" The man smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "You're asking the wrong question, Sergeant Davis." Rachel's stomach dropped. He knew who she was. How was that even possible? She had been off the grid for months, moving between cities under different names. Whoever these people were, they had resources. Look around you, the man continued, gesturing to the helicopter's interior. This is only the beginning. We've been watching you for a long time, Rachel. Watching what you've done. Watching what you're capable of. Rachel's mind was racing. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling despite herself. What do you want from me? He leaned in slightly, the words coming out like they were rehearsed. We want your skills, your training. We have a mission, and we need someone like you to help us finish it. Rachel felt her stomach churn. Mission? She had no idea what he was talking about. Whatever they were planning, it didn't seem like something she wanted to be involved in. The helicopter suddenly jolted, the sound of the engine intensifying as it climbed higher into the sky. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She tried to get a read on the man, but his expression remained unreadable, calm, almost too calm. You're a part of this now, he continued, his tone colder. You don't get to walk away. You've crossed a line, and now you're in this with us, whether you like it or not. Rachel clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. I don't do what I'm told. I do what I believe is right. The man's smile faded, and for the first time his eyes showed a flicker of something. Anger, maybe. You don't get to choose that anymore, he said quietly, his voice almost too calm. The choice was made for you when you decided to cross paths with us. Now you'll follow orders, and you'll do it our way. Rachel felt a surge of anger, but she kept it buried deep. She couldn't afford to make any more moves just yet. She needed to find out what he wanted, who was behind this operation, and most importantly, how she could escape. The helicopter shifted again, its engines whining as they altered course. Rachel could feel it in her gut. They weren't heading toward a city or any recognizable landmark. They were going somewhere isolated, somewhere off the map. The man in the suit's face softened as he stood up, walking toward the cockpit. He glanced back over at his shoulder, his voice quieter this time. You'll meet the others soon. They'll explain everything. Just don't try anything foolish. Rachel's mind was already racing. She couldn't let herself be taken without a fight. She had been trained to survive, to outthink and outmaneuver any enemy. And she wasn't about to give up now. Not without knowing exactly what she was up against. The helicopter continued its flight, the rumble of the engines growing louder as they pushed deeper into the night. Minutes passed, but time felt like it had slowed down, every second stretching longer than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the helicopter began its descent. Rachel's stomach tightened as she saw the dark expanse of land below, a barren, remote stretch of wilderness, far from any city or known military installation. It was a place that looked abandoned, forgotten. The helicopter touched down with a slight jolt, the rotors slowly winding down. The door slid open, and the man in the suit stepped out, motioning for Rachel to follow him. You're going to see something now, he said, his voice carrying a hint of something dangerous. And once you do, there's no turning back. Rachel hesitated. She wanted to run, to fight, to break free, but the thought of what might happen if she tried was chilling. She had no idea what this place was, what awaited her beyond those doors, but she knew one thing for sure: they weren't taking her alive for nothing. They were preparing her for something, and it was big. As she stepped out of the helicopter and onto the dirt ground, she glanced around, scanning her surroundings. There were no other helicopters, no signs of life, just miles of wilderness. But in the distance, she could make out a structure, dark and imposing, hidden from view. Welcome to the next phase, the man said, his voice colder than ever. This is where the real mission begins. Rachel's heart raced. Whatever this was, it was only just starting, and she had no idea what she was about to walk into. The air was thick with tension as Rachel followed the man in the suit toward the dark structure ahead. The ground beneath her boots was uneven, a mixture of rocky soil and patches of dead grass. The distant howl of the wind was the only sound as they moved, and every step she took felt like she was walking deeper into some kind of trap. Bird instinct screamed at her to turn and run, but she knew it wasn't an option. There were too many unknowns, too many risks, and she had learned the hard way that running could be just as dangerous as staying. The building loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the sky. It looked like an old military outpost, sturdy, well-constructed, but abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, and the entrance was marked by heavy steel doors that looked like they hadn't been touched in a long time. It didn't feel like a place of operation, more like a place of secrets. As they approached the door, Rachel's mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want from her? And why had they chosen this remote, desolate location? She had been in tough situations before, but this one felt different. This felt like the calm before the storm. The man in the suit, now walking a few paces ahead of her, turned back just as he reached the door. His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning her face as if trying to read her every thought. "Stay close," he said, his voice flat. "The less you do here, the better." Rachel's eyes flicked to the door, and for a moment she wondered what lay behind it. She had been through military installations, black ops facilities, and secretive government projects, but this place felt different. It felt like they were preparing her for something big, and she had no idea if she was ready for it. The door swung open with a heavy, mechanical groan. As they stepped inside, Rachel was immediately hit by the smell of stale air and the faint scent of rust. The room was dimly lit, and she could barely make out the shadowed forms of more people standing near the far wall. But what struck her first was the sense of space. The room was enormous, stretching back farther than she could see. It was a storage facility, maybe even a hangar of some sort, judging by the high ceilings and wide open area. In the center there was a large table surrounded by high-tech equipment and monitors, none of which seemed to have been used in years. "Sit," the man in the suit ordered, his voice cutting through the silence. Rachel didn't hesitate. She walked toward the table, her steps echoing in the vast space. Her eyes were scanning every inch of the room, trying to take in any possible escape routes, any weapons, any signs of weakness in the security. But there was nothing, just a cold, sterile atmosphere that made her skin crawl. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a place of operations, and she was about to find out exactly what kind of operation it was. As she sat down, she felt the man's eyes on her, studying her every move. A few moments passed in silence before he spoke again. "We've been watching you for a long time, Rachel," he said, his voice as calm and unfeeling as ever. "Your skills, your training, your resourcefulness, it's impressive. And now we need you to be part of something bigger." Rachel's mind raced. "What do you mean, bigger?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. "What is this? Some kind of recruitment for your twisted little army?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile someone gave when they were about to reveal something unpleasant. "This isn't an army. Not in the traditional sense. What we're doing here is far more specialized." He motioned for someone in the corner, a figure who stepped forward from the shadows. Rachel didn't recognize him, but he looked like he belonged here, cold, calculated, and dangerous. The man was dressed in tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask that made him seem even more intimidating. In his hands, he held a small black tablet. The man in the suit turned to Rachel, his expression hardening. "This is Agent Knox. He'll explain your role here. You'll listen to him carefully. You'll do exactly what he says. Otherwise, things will get complicated." Rachel's stomach twisted. "I'm not doing anything until I know exactly what's going on here. I'm not your pawn in some twisted game." The man's eyes flashed dangerously. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his tone dropping to a cold, almost threatening level. "And if you don't cooperate, you'll regret it." With that, Agent Knox stepped forward, sitting down at the table across from Rachel. The tablet in his hands flickered to life, and a map of the world appeared on the screen. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she looked at it, seeing red dots blinking in different locations across the globe. "This," Knox said, his voice low, "is our operation. It's global, and it's big. We're tracking something that could change the world. A new kind of weapon, a new kind of threat. Rachel didn't flinch. She had seen weapons before, some of the deadliest the world had to offer. But this felt different. Something in Knox's voice made her uneasy, and she wasn't sure why. He tapped a few buttons on the tablet, and the map zoomed in on a specific location. A small, remote village in a war-torn country. There was a blinking red dot at its center with a smaller circle surrounding it. "This is where we need you," Knox continued, his eyes locked on hers. "We believe a weapon has been hidden there, something that could change the course of history. It's highly classified, and it's a matter of international security. We need someone like you to infiltrate the area, locate the weapon, and ensure it's neutralized before it can fall into the wrong hands." Rachel stared at the screen, her thoughts spinning. A weapon. Was this why they had targeted her? Why they had been tracking her? But the whole thing felt off. There were too many details missing. Too many questions she couldn't answer. "And why me?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "What makes you think I'll help you with this?" Knox's expression remained stone cold. "Because we know what you're capable of, Rachel. You're a Navy SEAL, one of the best. We've already seen your skills in action. We've been watching you long enough to know you're exactly who we need for this." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. They had been watching her. They had been tracking her at every move, every breath. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their twisted little game from the moment they targeted her. "And if I refuse?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with defiance. The man in the suit, still standing near the doorway, finally spoke up. "You don't get to refuse. We already know what happens when someone crosses us. We've given you the choice, but if you refuse, we will make things much harder for you." Rachel's stomach churned. She was trapped. This wasn't some simple mission. It was a setup, a manipulation. She didn't know what these people really wanted, but she knew they had no intention of letting her walk away. She clenched her fists, her mind already racing through possible plans. She wasn't going to play their game, she couldn't. But she also couldn't afford to be reckless, not yet. They were still talking, still explaining things she barely understood, but Rachel wasn't listening anymore. She was already thinking ahead. She had to find a way out. But she'd also had to find out more about this weapon they were after. What kind of weapon was it? Who else was involved? And who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? There was one thing Rachel knew for sure. This mission, whatever it was, had just become her greatest challenge yet. The tension in the room was palpable. Rachel sat there, hands still bound by the cable, listening to Agent Knox and the man in the suit lay out their mission. Their words were like cold steel, meant to drive a point home, but they weren't enough to break her. Not yet. As Knox continued to tap away on the tablet, zooming in on various locations across the globe, Rachel's mind raced. There was something off about this operation, something that felt wrong. From the way they spoke about her, like she was some kind of tool, to the vague references to a mysterious weapon, it all felt too rehearsed. The tablet flashed again, and this time, a new image appeared on the screen. It was a photo of a man, his face blurred by shadows, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. Beneath the photo was a name, Viktor Krolov. "Who is this?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. The man in the suit glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Krolov is the one we believe is behind the weapon's creation. He's a former scientist, disappeared years ago off the grid. We know he's the one who developed it, but we don't know where he is now. But he's not the only one involved. There are others, powerful people." Rachel's eyes narrowed. A scientist who had disappeared off the grid? This was getting stranger by the minute. She had seen her fair share of black ops, but this wasn't like any mission she had ever been part of. And the fact that Krolov was still out there, unaccounted for, dangerous, only deepened the mystery. "Why haven't you found him?" Rachel asked, trying to keep the edge of frustration out of her voice. Agent Knox's expression darkened, and he shot a quick glance at the man in the suit before answering. It's not that simple. Krolov's work is highly classified, and his connections run deep. We've had our people looking for him for years, but we've hit dead ends. That's where you come in. Rachel leaned back in her seat, the cold steel of the chair biting into her back. And what exactly do you want me to do? Go to some war-torn country and hope I find a needle in a haystack. Knox didn't flinch. Your job will be to infiltrate a private facility. It's heavily guarded, but we believe that's where Krolov is hiding, or at least where he left his final research. The location is isolated, which means no one will be able to track you. Your mission is simple: find Krolov's research, neutralize it, and get out before anyone realizes what you've done. Rachel's eyes scanned the map again, focusing on the red dot over the remote village. The more they spoke, the more questions piled up. She knew this was no simple mission. No, this was something much bigger, and she had a sinking feeling that if she went through with it, she would be walking into a hornet's nest. Why is Krolov's research so important? She asked, her voice measured but laced with suspicion. What's this weapon? What makes it so dangerous? The man in the suit finally spoke up, his voice softer, almost conspiratorial. The weapon Krolov developed is unlike anything we've seen before. It's not a typical bomb or chemical weapon. It's something much worse. A weapon of mass manipulation, an AI-based system designed to control and brainwash people on a massive scale. It's not just about killing. It's about domination. Rachel's stomach twisted. An AI weapon that could manipulate people? That was on a whole different level of danger. It sounded like something out of a dystopian nightmare. And you think this weapon is in this facility? She asked, her voice tight with disbelief. Yes, Knox said, his eyes unwavering. That's what we believe. We think Krolov's research is the key to it. If we don't get our hands on it, it could fall into the wrong hands. And that could mean the end of everything. Rachel stared at the map again, her mind working overtime. The idea of going after something so dangerous didn't sit well with her. But at the same time, the SEAL training kicked in. She had always been taught to eliminate threats before they could do harm. This mission, however, wasn't as clear-cut. It felt like a high-stakes game with her caught right in the middle. But the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. Why hadn't they just sent a military team in to handle it? Why was she, one person, being dragged into this? Why me? She repeated, her voice firm. Why not send a team of experts? I'm just one person. The man in the suit finally met her gaze, his face revealing the slightest trace of something like admiration. Or maybe it was just calculation. Because, Rachel, you're more than just one person. You're someone they wouldn't expect. You're an asset. And you've already proven you can handle yourself under pressure. We need someone who can adapt, think on their feet, and make decisions quickly. You're the only one who fits the bill. Rachel's eyes narrowed. This was starting to sound more like a setup than a mission. She wasn't going to fall for their flattery. But she also knew she didn't have much of a choice. If she walked away from this, she might be risking her life and the lives of others. And what about you? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Who are you people? What's your real agenda here? The man in the suit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Knox, who nodded slightly before turning back to her. We're a group dedicated to protecting the world from threats that normal governments can't or won't handle. This operation is about keeping global security intact, even if that means going off the radar. We don't answer to anyone but ourselves. Rachel didn't like the sound of that. No oversight, no accountability. These were the kinds of organizations that played by their own rules, without regard for the bigger picture. I'm not sure I trust you, Rachel said flatly. And I'm not going to just follow your orders blindly. If I'm doing this, I need to know everything. The man in the suit gave a short, almost amused laugh. You'll have the information you need in time. But for now, you need to understand one thing. This mission is bigger than you. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than the whole world if it comes down to it. The weapon you're about to face, if it gets out of control, it could change the course of history. And not in a way anyone would want. Rachel's mind raced. She had been through plenty of tough situations in her career, but none of them felt like this. She wasn't just facing a dangerous enemy. She was up against a force that could manipulate minds, control people, and reshape the world as she knew it. Still, there was something about the mission that didn't add up. Something about the way they spoke, the way they treated her like a tool. Rachel wasn't someone's pawn. She wasn't going to let herself be used. But she also knew she couldn't just walk away from this. If what they were saying was true, this weapon had the potential to end everything. She couldn't let that happen. "You get one shot at this," she said finally, her voice cold with resolve. "If I'm in, I'm all in. But if you cross me, if you keep hiding the truth, I'll take you down. Understand?" The man in the suit regarded her silently for a moment before nodding. "Understood. But just remember, Rachel, we're all on the same side here. For now." Rachel didn't respond. Instead, she stood up and turned to walk toward the door, her mind already processing what lay ahead. The mission had just gotten real, and it was about to get a whole lot more dangerous. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the faint outline of the horizon to mark the transition from day to night. The cold air around Rachel felt like a warning, sharp and biting, reminding her of the urgency of the situation. As she stood outside the imposing structure, waiting for the next phase of the mission to unfold, her mind swirled with the gravity of what she just agreed to. The man in the suit and Agent Knox had given her a brief rundown of the mission specifics. She was supposed to infiltrate a high-security facility deep in a conflict zone, extract Krolov's research on the weapon, and neutralize it. There were no guarantees, and the risks were high. They'd made that much clear. But what they hadn't told her was why they were so certain Krolov's research was even there, or why they hadn't managed to retrieve it themselves. Rachel was no fool. She had seen enough dark corners of the world to know that people like Knox and the man in the suit didn't operate on trust alone. They operated on leverage, manipulation, and fear. It was why she was here, after all. They weren't asking for her help, they were forcing it. And while she wasn't averse to taking on dangerous missions, something about this whole setup felt off. The secrecy, the way they had monitored her every move, the veiled threats hanging over her head. It was a cocktail of danger she wasn't willing to swallow without taking a careful sip first. Her mind flickered back to the image of Viktor Krolov on the tablet screen. A scientist turned rogue who had developed a weapon that wasn't just about destruction. It was about control. Rachel had encountered her fair share of weapons over the years, but this one was different. And that difference was what terrified her the most. She had been part of covert operations before, but a mind control weapon? That was something she had no experience with, and it sent a chill down her spine. The soft thud of boots on gravel interrupted her thoughts. She turned and saw Agent Knox approaching, flanked by two heavily armed guards. The shadows of the night clung to them like a second skin, and the faint glow from the dim lights of the facility cast long, foreboding shadows on the ground. Knox's face was as unreadable as ever. He stopped a few feet away from Rachel, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze locked onto hers, studying her, like he was waiting for some kind of reaction. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Rachel didn't break the silence. Instead, she let her eyes move over the guards, assessing them. They were trained, no doubt. But she had spent years dealing with the best and worst, and she knew better than to be intimidated. "What now?" she finally asked, her voice steady. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of being rattled. Knox's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "We move out. The facility is a few miles from here. We'll have to travel under the radar. No comms, no signals. It's off the grid." Rachel nodded. "I'm assuming you've got the layout and intel on the area?" "We have all the intel you'll need," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But don't expect everything to be as easy as it seems. The facility's not only guarded by armed personnel. There are systems in place that will test your skills and your limits." Rachel didn't flinch. She had faced far worse. What kind of systems? Knox didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at one of the guards, who handed him a small tablet. Knox tapped a few buttons and then turned it toward Rachel. On the screen was a layout of the facility: high concrete walls, multiple checkpoints, and what appeared to be a small armed security team. But there were more details: sensor grids, pressure-sensitive floors, and what looked like infrared tripwires scattered throughout the complex. "There's more," Knox said, his tone grim. "We suspect Prolov's research is in a safe room in the heart of the facility. But getting there will be the challenge. The perimeter is heavily guarded and the interior is laced with high-tech security measures. You'll need to be careful." Rachel studied the screen, her mind calculating the most efficient route through the building. She could do this. She had been in situations where the odds were stacked against her, and she had come out on top. But this was different. There were no guarantees this time. There was no room for error. "I'll need equipment," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And I'm assuming you've got a plan for extraction once I get what I need." Knox glanced at the guards again, then nodded. "We'll provide what you need. And we've got a team standing by for extraction. You'll have to move quickly, though. We don't expect this to be a smooth operation." Rachel gave a sharp nod, her jaw tight. She wasn't used to depending on anyone for help. She worked alone. But this time there was no choice. These people might be as dangerous as the weapon they were after, but she had to play along if she wanted to get out of this alive. Before she could speak again, the man in the suit appeared from the shadows. He had been watching the exchange from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He walked toward Rachel and stopped in front of her, looking down at the tablet Knox held. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice colder than usual. Rachel met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm ready." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he seemed to consider her answer, his eyes scanning her face, as if measuring something. Then, without another word, he turned and gestured for her to follow him. Knox and the guards moved ahead, but Rachel held back for a moment, her eyes briefly flicking to the dark horizon. Something about this place, the remote facility, the covert mission, had a sense of finality to it. If she didn't come back, no one would know where she had gone or what had happened to her. No one but them. And that's when she realized she wasn't just going after a weapon. She was going into a hornet's nest, and if she wasn't careful, she might not make it out. As they began their journey toward the facility, the air grew colder, the weight of the mission pressing down on Rachel. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to drag her down. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. These people, this mission, the stakes, it was all too much. But she couldn't back out now. Not when she was this deep. The darkness ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a metaphor for the path she had chosen. The further they moved into the night, the more Rachel realized that this was no longer just a mission to stop a weapon. This was about survival. But who was she really fighting for? And what kind of enemy was she truly up against? The night stretched on, each step forward taking Rachel deeper into unfamiliar territory. The cold was biting, but it was the weight of what lay ahead that truly chilled her to the bone. As they moved through the rough terrain, past trees and low-hanging brush, the faint hum of distant machines, and the quiet murmur of voices from the facility ahead grew louder. The world around her was still, but the air felt charged with something that made every fiber of her body tense with anticipation. Rachel's mind was a blur of thoughts. She had trained for years, faced countless missions where death could have been only one wrong step away. But this felt different. This felt personal. There was something unsettling about the way the mission had been set up. The secrecy, the manipulation, the vague details that never seemed to add up. All of it gnawed at her, making her question everything. The man in the suit, who had been silent for the most part, now turned to face her. "We're close," he said in his usual cold tone, "but we need to approach quietly. There are guards everywhere." Rachel nodded, adjusting the strap on her gear. She had no intention of making noise. She'd been trained to move through shadows, to slip past unseen and unheard. But the closer they got, the more the facility began to feel less like a target and more like a fortress, an impenetrable wall of secrecy. She wondered what lay beyond those walls that made it so crucial to keep it hidden from the world. Knox was ahead of her, leading the way, with the two guards flanking him. Rachel moved between them, keeping her movements fluid, her senses heightened. The place was almost too quiet, and in that silence, every creak of the ground beneath her boots seemed unnaturally loud. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, but she kept it steady, slowing her breath, controlling the adrenaline, the fear that threatened to rise. They reached the perimeter fence, a series of high, razor-topped walls illuminated by weak floodlights that cut through the night like jagged knives. The tension was almost unbearable as they stopped behind a row of bushes that offered minimal cover. Knox motioned for them to halt, and Rachel crouched down beside him. She scanned the area, noting the guard positions and the blinking sensors that dotted the facility's boundary. It was a good security system, tight, well-coordinated, but nothing she couldn't work around. Her eyes flicked to the high-tech gear the team had handed her earlier. Night vision goggles, a grappling hook, and a small EMP device to disable the cameras. Everything she needed to make the entry as smooth as possible. "You'll go in first," Knox said, his voice low but firm. "Once you're in, disable the alarm system. We'll follow you inside. We'll stay in contact through the earpiece, but don't expect a lot of backup. If things go south, you'll need to handle it." Rachel gave a small nod, checking her equipment one last time. Her thoughts raced, calculating the moves ahead. This wasn't just about getting in. It was about getting out. She'd already been told there would be no backup if things went wrong. No guarantees. With a deep breath, she slipped on the night vision goggles. The world around her turned greenish-black, and she could see the glow of the sensors and the faint outlines of the guards patrolling. She exhaled quietly, feeling the calmness settle over her as she focused. "This is where you shine," Knox muttered, more to himself than to her. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had done this countless times before. She was good at it. In fact, she was the best, and that's why she was the one they sent in. She moved forward, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the fence. The EMP device, which was small enough to fit in her pocket, would disable the motion sensors just long enough for her to scale the fence and slip through undetected. She knew it was a risk. Every step was, but this was the job, and the job had to be done. Reaching the perimeter, Rachel knelt beside the fence, her hands working quickly to position the device. A quick push of a button, and the surrounding sensors blinked out of existence. She didn't waste any time. Her fingers gripped the bottom of the fence, and with a well-practiced motion, she used the grappling hook to pull herself over the top. Her feet hit the ground soundlessly, and she immediately dropped into a crouch, blending into the shadows. A quick scan of the area confirmed there were no immediate threats. The guards were on a rotating schedule. She could use the gaps in their patrols to move forward. Rachel was in. The facility was a maze of corridors and rooms, all dimly lit and sterile. She moved through it like a shadow, her every step calculated, every corner checked. It was unnerving, though, how empty it felt. She expected to hear the buzz of activity, the hum of machines. But there was nothing. It was as though the place had been abandoned. Yet the security was tight. The alarms were on high alert. It didn't make sense. She reached the first security checkpoint, a set of reinforced doors with a retinal scanner. Rachel studied it for a moment, the cold metal gleaming under the weak overhead lights. The EMP device had taken out the external surveillance, but this was a different kind of security. There was no way to bypass it without the right access. She moved quickly to the next room, a small control panel hidden against the wall. There had to be a way to disable the system. She had been trained in hacking, but she wasn't a tech genius. The odds weren't in her favor, but she had no choice. Rachel worked quickly, pulling out the tools she'd been given, trying to access the control panel. Her fingers moved with precision, her thoughts narrowed to one thing: get through, get the research, and get out. She had no interest in playing games with these people. The sooner she completed her task, the sooner she could escape the tangled web they had woven around her. But then she heard it. A low hum followed by a soft beeping sound. It was the sound of the security system being activated. Rachel froze, her heart racing. She had triggered something. Maybe it was the control panel. Maybe it was something else. But now she had only a few seconds to make her move before the alarms would go off, alerting everyone in the facility to her presence. Her eyes darted to the door. She couldn't afford to stay here, not when she knew the guards would be on high alert. She had to get to the safe room fast. But just as she turned toward the hall, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps. They were coming. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Her instincts kicked in, and she quickly pressed herself against the wall, her back flat against the cool concrete. The footsteps weren't hurried, but they were deliberate, purposeful. Whoever was coming, they weren't just casually patrolling. They were searching. She had no time to lose. She needed to move, and fast. Her mind raced, running through possible escape routes. The hallways were narrow, and the guard steps were in sync with the position of the nearby cameras. She couldn't afford to be seen. If they caught her, everything would fall apart. The mission would fail. And worse, if the facility's research got out, the consequences could be catastrophic. Her eyes flicked to the door at the far end of the hallway, the one that led deeper into the complex. She needed to reach it, but the sound of the footsteps was growing louder by the second. Whoever was approaching had to be less than 30 feet away by now. Rachel's hand instinctively reached for her sidearm, but she didn't draw it. She wasn't here to kill anyone, not unless it was absolutely necessary. She wasn't here to make noise. She was here to disappear. A sudden flash of light startled her. A guard's flashlight sweeping across the corridor. Rachel froze, barely breathing. The light passed over her, and she remained perfectly still like a statue, praying that her shadow didn't give her away. The footsteps came closer, now unmistakably at the corner. The guard was almost on her. She glanced back over her shoulder, the exit within sight, and then made a split-second decision. Without warning, she pivoted on her heel and dashed for the door, her feet barely making a sound on the floor. She moved like a ghost, slipping through the crack just as the guard turned the corner. She heard the distinct rattle of his boots hitting the ground, followed by a muttered curse as the beam of light moved past her. For a moment, Rachel thought she'd been spotted, but the guard didn't stop. The sound of his footsteps retreated down the hall. She exhaled quietly, the tension leaving her body in an almost painful rush. She had made it. Barely. Rachel moved quickly through the door, sliding into a darkened corridor. The atmosphere here was different, thick with the faint hum of machinery and the soft click of doors that seemed to lead into more secure areas of the facility. She kept low, listening for any sound that might indicate another threat. Every step brought her closer to the heart of the facility, the safe room, Krolov's research. As she neared the intersection, she slowed her pace, peering around the corner. Ahead of her was a steel door locked, with another retinal scanner and a security pad. It was the type of door you didn't open unless you had clearance. But she didn't need clearance. She had the tools and the skills to get in, and she wasn't about to be stopped by a locked door. Rachel approached the door, taking a moment to check the immediate area for cameras. She had no intention of triggering another alarm. Her fingers moved swiftly, tapping into the access panel beside the door. The EMP device she had used earlier had temporarily disabled external security, but this would require a more subtle touch. She couldn't afford another mishap. She worked quickly, her heart hammering in her chest as she bypassed the security lock. It wasn't long before she heard the satisfying click of the door unlocking. The heavy steel door creaked open, and she slipped inside, closing it behind her as quietly as possible. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a few overhead lights, their flickering the only indication that the facility hadn't completely shut down. She moved swiftly toward the center of the room, where a large, imposing computer sat. It was old school in design, solid, reliable, and capable of housing a great deal of information. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. This was it. the heart of the operation. If Krolov's research was anywhere, it was here. She stepped up to the terminal and ran her fingers over the keys. The screen blinked to life, its interface an array of complex data and encrypted files. She didn't have time to read everything. She only needed the crucial data. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, bypassing encryption codes, working through layers of firewalls. Her mind was sharp, calculating, as she searched for anything related to the weapon. As the minutes ticked by, she felt the familiar adrenaline surge. This was the moment. She had done this before, infiltrated systems, retrieved intel. But nothing had ever felt this high stakes. And then there it was, a file labeled Project Vesper. Rachel's stomach tightened. That was the name of the weapon. The AI system Krolov had developed, designed to manipulate minds on a mass scale. She clicked it open without hesitation. The file revealed plans, blueprints, and research that made her blood run cold. It was a complete AI-driven neural system, capable of manipulating human thoughts, emotions, and actions through direct interaction with the brain. It could change people, force them to do things they normally wouldn't, erasing free will entirely. Rachel's hands shook slightly as she scanned the document. The implications were terrifying. This was more than a weapon. It was a tool for total control, a means of shaping entire populations with no resistance. A weapon like this could bring down governments, destabilize entire societies, and leave people powerless. And it was real. Just as she was about to download the files, a warning message popped up on the screen. Warning, unauthorized access detected. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't triggered any alarms, had she? No, she was certain of it. But the message wasn't just a standard alert. It was something more urgent. Her eyes scanned the screen as another message flashed, this one more ominous. Backup initiated. System lockdown in progress. Security breach confirmed. They know. The realization hit her like a hammer. Someone had detected her. Maybe it was the guard who had almost caught her, or maybe someone else had been monitoring the system. Either way, she had only moments before the entire facility would go into lockdown. She cursed under her breath. There was no time to waste. She quickly tapped a few more keys, downloading the file into a secure drive she'd been carrying. The data was too important to leave behind. But before she could finish the transfer, the lights above her flickered, and the low hum of the facility shifted to an intense, high-pitched whine. The countdown to lockdown had begun. The high-pitched whine of the security system echoed through the room, a chilling reminder that time was running out. Rachel's fingers flew across the keyboard, desperately trying to finish the download, but the screen was flickering rapidly, the progress bar stalling as the system fought back. The familiar sense of urgency crept in, a tightening in her chest that told her she was running out of time. 10 seconds, she thought, her mind calculating. With every passing moment, the countdown to lockdown grew more intense. The facility was about to seal itself off, and once it did, escape would be impossible. She needed that data. She needed to finish the transfer now. Come on, she willed the machine, her hand poised over the mouse. Her breath was shallow, her pulse quickening with each tick of the clock. The backup system was activating fast, disabling her access. If she didn't act now, everything would be lost. Suddenly, the screen blinked and the download completed. Rachel felt a surge of relief flood through her, but it was short-lived. The moment she grabbed the drive, the lights in the room blinked out, plunging her into darkness. For a split second, everything froze. She couldn't see anything, couldn't even hear the whine of the security system anymore. It was like the whole facility had gone dead. Then the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow across the room. A deep mechanical voice crackled through the speakers overhead. Security breach in progress. Lockdown initiated. All personnel to designated safe zones immediately. Rachel didn't wait for the system to finish its announcement. She slid the drive into her tactical vest, then grabbed her weapon. The whole building would be going on high alert any second now, and she had no intention of being trapped inside when the security doors slammed shut. The facility wasn't just going to lock down. It was going to lock her in. She had seen this before, in other places, other missions. The security systems in these kinds of facilities weren't just designed to stop intruders, they were designed to contain them. And she had no intention of being caught in this trap. She bolted toward the door, but before she could even reach the hallway, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the entrance. Someone was coming. She ducked back into the shadows, pressing her back to the cold concrete wall. Her heart raced, her muscles tensed, and her eyes narrowed as she waited for the figure to pass. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Rachel didn't dare to move. She could feel the presence of the guard before she even saw him, could hear his breath, his movements. She forced herself to stay still, blending into the shadows, the red emergency lights casting long, unnatural shadows across the floor. The guard's shadow stretched along the wall, and Rachel held her breath. He was just a few feet away now, his boots thumping heavily against the floor. She could hear him muttering into his radio, the static buzz of his voice cutting through the silence. "Report status," he said gruffly. "Security breach," came the reply through his earpiece. "Lockdown in progress. All personnel evacuating to level 3. Move out immediately." Rachel's eyes flicked to the door at the end of the hallway. The guard would be moving toward it soon, and she had to act quickly. The longer she waited, the more likely it was someone else would come along and catch her. With a sharp, controlled breath, she moved silently toward the opposite side of the corridor, staying as low as possible. The guard was now standing in the doorway, his attention on his radio, not aware of her presence. This was her chance. Rachel slipped past him, staying to the edges of the hallway, hugging the wall as she moved quickly but quietly. Every footstep felt like a hammer blow in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady, her mind focused on the goal. She didn't dare look back. Not yet. She rounded a corner and headed down another narrow hallway. The facility seemed to be designed like a labyrinth, endless corridors, locked doors, and unmarked passages that would make it nearly impossible for an intruder to navigate without a map. Rachel knew this place was her battlefield, and she had trained for moments like this. But she also knew that the clock was ticking. The longer she stayed in the facility, the greater the chance she'd be cornered, caught, and locked down for good. The sound of more footsteps, heavier this time, grew louder behind her. Another patrol likely heading in her direction. They must have picked up on her movements from the security system. There was no way to know how many guards were in the building, but if they managed to coordinate, she could easily end up trapped in a dead-end hallway with no way out. Rachel's mind raced. She had a few seconds before the lockdown fully engaged. If she could just make it to the extraction point, if the team was still waiting for her, she might stand a chance. But if they had been compromised or moved, her only option would be to fight her way out. She rounded another corner, this time aiming for a stairwell that would take her down to the lower levels. From there, she could find the access point where the team had planned to pick her up. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. But as she reached the stairwell, she froze. 2 guards stood at the bottom, their guns trained on the door. Their radios crackled with the same urgent instructions Rachel had heard earlier. Security breach. Priority target. Infiltrator. Rachel's mind went into overdrive. There was no way past them, not without a fight. And with the whole facility locked down, it wouldn't be long before more guards arrived. She was running out of options. Her eyes darted around the stairwell. The walls were bare, no doors, no windows. The only way out was through the guards, and that wasn't going to be easy. For a moment, she thought about turning back, finding another route, avoiding the confrontation. But she knew that wouldn't work. The facility was locking down, and the walls were closing in. If she didn't act now, she'd be trapped in this stairwell with no way to escape. She quickly glanced down at her gear, her mind calculating. The EMP device. It could take out the facility's electrical systems for a few seconds. Just enough to create an opening. Rachel exhaled, steadying herself. She had only one shot at this. The element of surprise was on her side, but it wouldn't last long. She reached into her pack, pulled out the EMP, and tossed it across the stairwell, just past the 2 guards, She aimed carefully, making sure it would land between them, and with a soft click, it activated. The guards didn't notice at first. Their attention was still focused on the door. But then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the entire facility into darkness. The hum of electricity stopped, the air turned stale, and the sound of the backup generators kicking in was deafening. In the instant of darkness, Rachel was already moving. She dashed forward, using the guard's confusion to her advantage. One of the guards reached for his radio, but it was too late. Rachel closed the distance in seconds, her booted foot slamming into his chest and knocking him backward into the wall. The second guard, more alert, swung his rifle toward her, but Rachel was already moving, her hand snapping out to grab his wrist, twisting it until the weapon was dislodged from his grip. In the darkness, she used the moment of disorientation to knock him unconscious with a sharp blow to the head. The stairwell fell silent once more. Rachel took a deep breath, grabbing both rifles as she moved past the guards and down the stairs. She wasn't out of danger yet, but she was closer. And now the only thing left was the extraction point. The sound of her boots echoed down the darkened stairwell as Rachel descended. Her mind was a blur of calculations, her instincts on high alert. Every step brought her closer to the extraction point, but with each passing second, she could feel the pressure building. The facility was in full lockdown, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the entire place was swarming with guards. If she didn't move fast enough, she'd be cornered. The flashing red lights of the emergency system bathed the stairs in an eerie glow, but the darkness was still overwhelming. Every corner could hide another guard. Every turn could lead to a dead end. She had no idea how many people were inside the building, but she knew that if she didn't make it to the extraction point soon, she'd never get out. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused for a moment to assess her situation. The hallway in front of her was long and narrow, lined with doors that likely led to storage rooms, offices, or other secured areas. There was no sign of movement, no sound of footsteps, but Rachel wasn't fooled. The facility's lockdown had to be in full effect now. Guards would be patrolling every hallway, every exit. She reached into her vest, pulling out the small map of the facility she'd memorized earlier. The extraction point was just a few levels below, near the east wing. The path was clear, if she could make it through the security checkpoint. As she stepped forward, she heard a faint buzzing sound, the telltale noise of an approaching patrol. She cursed under her breath, looking for a place to hide. There was nowhere near her to duck into. A few doors ahead, the hallway split into two directions, but the sounds of the footsteps told her they were coming from the left. Rachel's mind worked quickly. She couldn't afford to be seen. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breathing shallow, but she kept herself calm, too calm. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out the small smoke grenade she'd been carrying. It was a last resort. She hated using it, but desperate times called for desperate measures. She pulled the pin, tossing it a few feet down the hallway. The grenade hissed and released a thick cloud of smoke that immediately began to obscure her vision. The sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder, and the guards would be through the smoke in seconds. But Rachel didn't waste any time. She darted down the opposite corridor, keeping low, blending into the shadows. The smoke worked in her favor. The guards slowed their pace, wary of the obstruction, but it wasn't long before they figured out what had happened. A shout echoed down the hall, and Rachel knew they were closing in. She moved faster now, her heart beating harder. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she sprinted down the narrow corridor, weaving through the maze of doors and rooms. She could hear the sound of pursuit behind her, their footsteps growing louder, but she didn't dare look back. If she stopped, even for a second, they would catch her. A sudden noise ahead caught her attention. A door opening. It was one of the facility's security checkpoints, and the guard station there was distracted by the noise. Rachel acted quickly, ducking into an open storage room to her right. She slipped behind some crates and boxes, pressing herself into the corner, her breath catching in her throat. She had only seconds before the guard passed, but in that moment she realized something chilling. The facility wasn't just on lockdown for security. Something else was happening. The alarm, the flashing lights, the urgency. It wasn't just because of her presence. It was because of the data she had taken. Whoever was in charge was willing to let everything collapse to protect it. The stakes had just gotten higher, much higher. The sound of the guard's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Rachel held her breath, praying that he wouldn't stop and check the storage room. He was close, too close. She could hear his heavy boots, the clicking of his radio, and then silence. The guard had passed. Rachel exhaled slowly, wiping the sweat from her brow. She wasn't out of danger, not by a long shot, but at least for now she had bought herself some time. Her mind raced. The extraction point was only a few more hallways away. But she had no illusions about what would happen if she were caught. The data she had taken was dangerous, deadly. If the people inside this facility got their hands on it again, they wouldn't hesitate to erase every trace of her involvement. She had to get out. She had to make it to the extraction point before it was too late. She slipped out of the storage room, moving quickly but quietly, keeping to the edges of the hallway. The deeper she went into the facility, the more she realized how methodically it had been built. Every corridor seemed to lead to another, and every turn felt like it was meant to confuse her. She wasn't just up against guards, she was up against the very design of the place itself. And yet she moved with a quiet confidence, each step taken with precision. She could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system, the soft buzz of the overhead lights, but all of that seemed distant as she focused on her path ahead. It wasn't until she reached the next security checkpoint that things went horribly wrong. She had been careful, too careful. But just as she approached the turn that would lead her to the final stretch of the hall, her comms crackled to life, the sudden sound breaking her focus. "Rachel." Knox's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "You've got company." Rachel's stomach dropped. She had been so focused on the path ahead, so concentrated on the goal that she hadn't thought about the bigger picture. How many guards had been alerted? Was the extraction point still secure? Knox's voice came again, more desperate this time. "You need to move fast. We don't have much time. They've locked the entire perimeter to get to the east exit now. You'll have a team waiting for you, but you have to hurry." Rachel clenched her jaw. She didn't need to hear the urgency in his voice to know the situation had gotten critical. It wasn't just about getting the data anymore. It was about survival. She turned the corner, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps rushing toward her from the far end of the hallway. There were more guards than she had anticipated. Much more. The wall seemed to close in and her pulse quickened. She had to make a decision. In that instant, her mind flashed to the east exit, the one place that might give her the chance to escape, but only if she made it there in time. She was so close. Yet she could already feel the weight of the walls tightening around her, like a trap slowly closing shut. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the hallway, followed by shouts. The alarm blared again, and Rachel's heart raced. The facility was in full lockdown now. Every exit was sealed. But she had no choice. She had to run. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribcage as she turned on her heel, her instincts kicking into overdrive. The crash she'd heard had come from the far end of the hall. She had no idea what it was, but it didn't matter now. The guards would be distracted for a moment, but they wouldn't be for long. Every second that passed was another step closer to being trapped in this nightmare of concrete and steel. She sprinted forward, her breath steady but quick, her boots pounding against the floor with urgency. The east exit wasn't far, just a few more halls, a quick turn, and if she could make it, she could escape. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one she had left. As she raced through the hall, her eyes scanned the walls, the doors, looking for anything that could be a potential threat. Her fingers grazed the grip of her weapon as she kept her back straight, moving with purpose. The low hum of the facility's emergency lights buzzed in her ears, and the red glow cast long, terrifying shadows across the hallway. But the sounds of pursuit were getting closer too. A guard shouted something down the hallway, a voice she couldn't quite make out over the hum of the facility. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Ahead, the hallway split into two, one path leading toward a security checkpoint, and another toward a staircase that led down toward the exit. Her map had shown the quickest way was down, but now, with the voices of more guards filling the air, she had to decide fast. Stairs or checkpoint. She didn't have the luxury of time. Rachel darted to the left, down the staircase, her boots clicking on the concrete steps. The stairwell was dimly lit, narrow, and she could hear the echo of footsteps behind her. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure how many guards were chasing her. But there was no way to outrun all of them, not with the facility going into lockdown. The bottom of the stairwell opened into another hallway, longer and emptier, but she had to move quickly. She sprinted toward the door at the end, the extraction point just beyond it. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind her. She whipped her head around. A guard had just fired a shot, aiming directly at her. The bullet flew past her head, the sound of it cutting through the air like a knife. Rachel didn't even hesitate. She dove to the side, rolling across the cold concrete floor as the sound of more shots echoed in the narrow corridor. She slid into a crouch, gun raised, her senses on high alert as she scanned the hallway. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. The guards would be closing in soon, and the hallway was narrow. No place to hide. She kept moving, eyes fixed on the door ahead, praying it was still open. Another shot rang out, and Rachel didn't hesitate. She fired back. The guard stumbled back, cursing under his breath, but he didn't fall. She couldn't afford another exchange like that, not with more guards coming. She ducked into the shadows, waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade, but there was no time to wait. The door to the extraction point was just ahead, less than 10 feet away now. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps as she rushed forward, pushing herself harder than she had before. She couldn't afford to be caught now. If she made it out, everything she had done would be worth it. If she didn't, if they captured her, the mission would be over. The data, Krolov's research, would fall into their hands, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Rachel reached the door, only to find it locked. A voice crackled over her comms. "Rachel, we've got eyes on you. You're almost there. Hold tight. We've got backup ready to move in." She didn't waste a second. She pulled out the small device she'd been carrying since the start of the mission, the last bit of technology she had left to get her through the worst. The door was equipped with a biometric lock, but it would be no match for her EMP. She tossed the device to the door's console, and in seconds, the light on the door blinked green. She pushed it open, and then, a voice. "Hold it right there." Rachel's head whipped around. 2 guards appeared from the darkness, weapons drawn. They were fast. Too fast. She froze, adrenaline pumping through her veins. It was a standoff now. No room to maneuver, no way to escape without a fight. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, his gun aimed squarely at her chest. But Rachel didn't drop the weapon. Instead, she took one small step back, her gun steady in her hands. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. She was out of options, but she knew the fight wasn't over. "Back up," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "I don't want to have to use this." The guards didn't budge. They were trained. They were ready. But so was she. The seconds stretched into eternity. Rachel could feel the tension in the air, the cold sweat on her brow. Her grip tightened on her weapon, but she didn't make the first move. She wasn't going to. She'd done enough to get here. No more fighting unless it was absolutely necessary. The guards exchanged a glance. One of them shifted his weight, just enough for Rachel to see the glint of his radio. In that moment, she knew they were trying to call for reinforcements. They'd seen her, they knew what she had taken. They wouldn't let her leave without a fight. The first guard took another step toward her, and Rachel moved faster than she ever had before. She whipped around and fired a shot, quick, precise. It hit him in the shoulder, sending him crashing into the wall. The second guard barely had time to react, but it didn't matter. Rachel was already on him. She dropped to the floor, sliding past him on her knees, and in one swift motion, she twisted his wrist, knocking the weapon from his hand. Before he could recover, she had him pinned to the ground, her knee in his chest, her gun aimed at his head. "Stay down," she muttered, out of breath, her heart still racing. The guard didn't move, and Rachel didn't waste a second. She stood up, holstered her weapon, and dashed through the door into the extraction point. As soon as she entered, she was met by a familiar face, Knox. "Rachel," he said, his voice tight with relief. "You made it." She didn't have the energy to respond, she just nodded, her body finally relaxing as she let herself sink into the safety of the room. But there was no time to rest. The facility was still on lockdown, and as much as Rachel wanted to celebrate her escape, she knew that the mission wasn't over. Krolov's research, the weapon, was still out there. There were still people who would do anything to get their hands on it. And she had no intention of letting that happen. As the door slammed shut behind them, Rachel turned to Knox. "Get us out of here. Now." And just as the sounds of reinforcements echoed from the hallway, the extraction team moved into position, ready for the next fight. The facility trembled as Rachel and Knox made their way deeper into the extraction zone. The emergency alarms were still blaring, and every inch of the building seemed to be closing in on them. Guards were scrambling through the halls, but the extraction team had set up a secure perimeter, making it clear that this wasn't just about getting Rachel out. It was about stopping anyone from pursuing them. As they hurried down the dimly lit corridors, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't behind her yet. The data she had taken from the facility wasn't just any high-level intelligence. It was the key to a weapon that could shift the global balance of power. If the wrong hands got hold of it, the consequences would be disastrous. The extraction point was just ahead. Rachel's pulse was still racing, but the sound of the security systems trying to break through the lockdown felt like a constant drumbeat in the background. She didn't have time to waste. "We need to move faster," she muttered to Knox, who was by her side. His jaw was set in a grim line, his eyes scanning every corner and every door. "I know," he replied. "The team's ready, but we've got about 5 minutes before this place gets swarmed. They'll be on full lockdown soon, and we won't get another shot at this." Rachel's hand tightened around the data drive hidden under her vest. The facility's blueprints they had obtained showed an extraction pad just outside the east perimeter. A small, unmarked landing zone away from the main runway. That's where their chopper was waiting, but getting there would be no easy task. They reached the extraction zone, a small fortified room with a few men standing guard, rifles in hand. The air was thick with tension, and Rachel knew that despite their preparation, things could still go south fast. The countdown to total lockdown had already begun, and if they didn't leave now, the exit would be sealed off. One of the team members nodded at her as she approached, his face as stern as Knox's. "We've got about 3 minutes," he said, his voice low but urgent. "The perimeter's holding, but that won't last. We'll cover you." Knox gave him a brief nod before turning to Rachel. "This is it. You're almost there." Rachel barely had time to acknowledge his words before the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway. More guards. They were closing in fast. The team immediately sprang into action, positioning themselves at the door and readying their weapons. "On my mark, we move," one of them said. Rachel stood at the ready, her breath steady as she focused on the task ahead. The tension in her shoulders tightened as she kept her eyes on the door. The seconds ticked by like hours, but she couldn't afford to let fear creep in. She had come too far. And then, bang! The door crashed open. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze, her hand on her weapon, her mind calculating the next move, the chaos of the facility closing in around her. The guards had arrived. At least 5 of them, just enough to make things complicated. "Go!" Knox barked, and the team moved into action. Rachel didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the hall, her weapon ready, as the team laid down suppressive fire. The guards were momentarily stunned, but they quickly recovered, firing back. Rachel barely dodged a bullet that skimmed her shoulder, her focus never wavering. She couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to get hit. Ahead, the chopper's low hum filled the air. Rachel turned a corner, and there it was, the small, unmarked landing pad, just as she'd been briefed. The helicopter was already spinning up, its blades slicing the air. The wind from the rotors whipped against her face, the cold air a welcome relief after the oppressive heat of the building. She made a dash for it. As she reached the helicopter, a bullet whizzed past her. Another close call. But before the guards could get any closer, the extraction team had the chopper in full gear, and within seconds, they were lifting off, leaving the facility behind. Rachel slumped into her seat, breathing heavily, her heart still racing from the escape. But she couldn't let herself relax, not yet. They weren't out of danger. The mission wasn't over. "Status report?" she asked, her voice strained but steady as she glanced around at the team. Knox was seated across from her, his face set in hard lines. "Good to go," he replied. "The chopper's secure. We're clear for now, but we've got a long road ahead. That data is already in motion. Headquarters is prepping for the next phase, but they'll need everything you've got." Rachel nodded, gripping the armrests of the seat. Her mind was already processing what had just happened, trying to make sense of it all. She had escaped the facility, but the data she had taken was too dangerous to be left in anyone's hands. The weapon Krolov had been developing was no longer a secret. It was a ticking time bomb, and it wouldn't be long before the world learned about it. The next steps would be crucial. She turned to Knox. "We need to get to Washington. It's time to brief the higher-ups. This goes way beyond the mission." Knox gave a tight nod. "I know. And believe me, they're not going to like it. But at least we've got the intel. For now, we have the advantage." The chopper banked sharply, heading toward the horizon. Rachel leaned back, her eyes closing for a moment as the adrenaline slowly began to fade. Her body was sore, bruised from the battle she'd fought inside that building, but her mind was sharp. They had won this round. But she knew better than anyone that the battle wasn't over. Far from it. As the helicopter ascended into the night sky, Rachel looked out over the landscape below, a chill creeping into her bones. She had done her part, but the world wasn't ready for what was coming. And she didn't know yet who would come for the weapon next, but she was ready. Because whatever happened next, she wouldn't stop until the world was safe from whatever Krolov had unleashed. And as the chopper soared higher, Rachel finally allowed herself one thought to ease the weight of the night. For now, the mission was over. The fight would continue. But they had won.